I'm not sure this is really my area. I suppose from my experience, at least in Australia, more and more universities there are working out that they need to collaborate so they can compete on a worldwide scale. But I think the interesting thing about the collaboration is it's actually more based on actual human beings rather than university policies. We have a lot of joint programs for PhD students all around the world, and they're almost invariably because the supervisor at our university, Australian National University, knows a supervisor, I don't know, at Ian's university, and they're friends, and they work things out together. It's not because universities have set it up. So it's just an interesting notion of to what extent can organisations and policies cause collaboration rather than it being the human beings that do it. In terms of we're talking about ethics training. I do know that you talked about one of the alliances being the International Alliance of Research Universities, to which my university is a member. And at a recent meeting, they decided that they would make sure that there would be all doctoral students would have compulsory ethics training, and then that's now in Australia. We have the group of 8 universities, which is obviously 8. And they've all agreed that all of their candidates will have compulsory ethics training. So I don't know about the other groups of universities. Helene and Terry might want to comment. But that sort of thing is becoming absolutely critical.
I'm always struck by as much progress as we make in the international higher ed community, how little progress we make in talking about the normative versus the scientific, if you will, convergence of what we do. And even when we talk about the social sciences, we talk about the social sciences and humanities versus the sciences. So I guess the short answer to the question is that where I think we really need to focus our attention is on and I'm going to use strong language here, on the moral imperatives that are really facing our countries worldwide, and the moral imperatives that really undergird the 3 task force papers that are the foci of this conference, and that we need to not bifurcate our thinking or our mindset or our gestalt, if you will, about how we address the sciences, the technology, et cetera, and then how afterwards, as a second thought, we talk about the social impact or the ethical considerations, but rather we force our thinking so that we can have a convergence where we consider the two together. Because I think that's why we face so many problems in the world today, and that might be an oversimplification, but in academia we continue to think in very bifurcated paths. And to the extent we can address what Vaidak was saying, what is the social impact of what we do? And we saw a very, very small example of this kind of convergence, I think, in America. It took a catastrophe, and it was with Katrina. And what we saw were hundreds of students, young people, who were in programs known as Teach for America, AmeriCorps, which was kind of like our domestic Peace Corps, coming and utilizing their expertise and their knowledge, regardless of their education, to address what for us was a moral imperative. And so we saw the social impact, but that was one very rare case.
I think doctoral education is first and foremost about creation of new knowledge. That's why I wouldn't, let's say, link the two in the way you did with respect to patents or any other licenses or something like that. I think that would really overstretch the case of doing a doctoral thesis. It may be a byproduct in some cases, and these days we know how short the cycle can be. But if you, let's say, put that kind of stress on the doctoral student at the same time, I think that would probably almost be a notion to fail. So I think with respect to patents and other outcomes, one has to be more patient. there are a lot of studies that provide evidence that those who invest a lot in doctoral training and postdoctoral training also do much better with respect to the more generic technologies and other areas of society. So there is a link, but it's very difficult to provide evidence in specific cases, as far as I can see, at least what I know from these various studies on innovation policies and their impact. With respect to country relevance, if I may pick up that question as well, there are, of course, despite the global economy, a lot of issues at stake, particularly, for instance, to give you an example from the workshop last week on sustainable value chains, you see. Currently, 50% of all the fresh fruit and vegetables produced in Africa are lost on their way to the consumer because there's no adequate technology around. So this will be probably, it's still under negotiation with our African colleagues, will be one of the priorities in our new call for proposals. So it is a matter of negotiating and of listening to the local voices, despite all the challenges involved in globalization.
I think joining these together, nothing has been said exists in a vacuum. And the question of innovation is much wider than science and technology per se. Innovation is a climate where things can be done and where creative people are allowed to experiment. And it is not necessarily high level, it can be extremely practical. And that is why technology and the adult version of technology, engineering, if you like, are so important. And this is why, incidentally, in so many countries, including the OECD, there is huge concern about the weakness of science teaching at the lower levels of education. I'm sure this strikes a chord with everyone. You can't have a cohort of scientists unless you start very early, and this is a really serious problem. As for the social relevance, this is easier to measure because if you're putting in, for example, a medical vaccination program or a research program in something like AIDS, you will see a result in terms of progress or no progress faster. And people will probably rally to that because it's tackling something that is very specific and very serious. I think there's a lot of scope for collaborative research which actually justifies all these parameters in the same in the same basket, because when you see something, students will be attracted to doing something that is very practical. Young people are extremely practical. They don't want to waste their time. They want orientation, they want results, they want to contribute. And they're the easiest ones to sell it to, in my view. You can sell it to the university, it makes it look good because it's part of the wider social effort. The people I find most irritating, with great respect to my colleague, are those who jump on the evaluation bandwagon. It was George Bernard Shaw who said those who can do and those who can't teach. And there is nothing worse now than the next new thing, which is the evaluation group. And they're everywhere. They're in companies, they're in the UN, they're evaluating you. Who's evaluating them? Because their numbers are huge. And if you let people do what they're good at, you'll get some result with creative thinking. One last point is the absence of the private sector in many of these contexts we've been describing. We talked about the weak technology area. Another very serious gap in low-income countries is the very, very weak or informal private sector, which cannot underpin and help and take creative thinking, so that when people, for example, are good at patents, not the high-level patents, the simple, innovating technology, there's nowhere that it can be instantly applied. And that is one of the great weaknesses in many of the countries you've just mentioned, the fruit and vegetable market. The flower market is another area where Africa has had a wonderful opportunity. It's a continuum, unless all the pieces are in place. So you're working in a partial environment.